This conference will now be recorded.
All right. So, firstly, any questions, guys, before we get started? Any questions I can take before we can go ahead and get started with today's session? Right. So, until now, we've been looking at a couple of things out here. So, let me put my flow diagram once again, and let's understand what exactly that we are getting into today and why we are getting into, let's say, what we're getting into today. So, let's go ahead and take a branch and let's talk about a couple of things right now. So, I have a repository, I have a branch again. As a developer, using my local machine, I am able to, let's say, create something called as a pull request using a feature branch on my local machine that I created. And as and when I update the develop branch of my repository, I have a build pipeline that is getting triggered. This build pipeline is giving me artifacts in the form of a zip file, in the form of a JSON, in the form of a commands and all that stuff. So I'm getting the artifacts that I'm storing inside the Azure pipeline. So Azure DevOps has its own artifactory. I'm storing all the artifacts there. And using that particular artifacts, I'm going into something called as a release pipeline in Azure DevOps. And releasing all these artifacts onto something called as a destination target service, like let's say the web app and all that stuff. And also we are doing it in a staged manner, in a phased manner, wherein I'm going ahead and let's say deploying all the code, let's say onto my Azure web apps out here as such. Now, one question that I would like to ask you all is that as a developer, I go ahead and try to commit my code into this particular branch called as the develop branch of my repository. So I go ahead and try to commit my code onto the develop branch out here, guys. Very first question, can I commit my code directly onto the develop branch?
No,
If not,
we need sub-branch.
you need, let's say, a feature branch in order to go ahead and, let's say,
Yes.
deploy this out or merge this out. But why? Why exactly do we need that? Why can't we
It's a
go ahead and
policy and default one.
policies? And it's a policies, it's a default branch, so we put something called as policy. So the question again is, why did we
Backup.
put policies in? Main is a backup, yes, that's fine. But the question here is that why did we place policies in the first place? What exactly is the factor, or why exactly did we place something called as policies out here? What are we trying to achieve using the policies?
Number of developers are working. That's why
Hmm.
we writing
That's
code
fine.
in that
Okay.
can restrict that persons.
Okay, but why do you want to restrict that person? Or what is the idea of restricting this particular person out here? Anyone? Why
Yeah,
exactly we
code,
want
yeah,
good please.
it's code quality.
Code quality, exactly. Code quality, main point, code quality, which means that I don't want code with a lot of bugs coming into my branch. Code quality, yes, this is the word that I was expecting. Code quality. I don't want code with, let's say, a lot of bugs, a lot of issues coming into the develop branch of my repository. This is something that I wanted to avoid, and that's the reason I have a policy telling that at least someone should come again approve my code. There should be something called as a work item for traceability and trackability purposes, accountability and all that stuff. Comments must sorry, comments must be resolved and all those things out here such. So this is what I wanted, and that's the reason I am putting something called as a policy on my develop branch, so that once the code comes in, the build and the release are smooth. So for my software development lifecycle to work fine, the code quality should be good. This is the first principle that I'm following. Second thing, is that I want my build pipelines to also be smooth and my release pipelines should also be smooth out here. That's the reason I'm putting a branch policy in here as such. Now, let's say that the code quality is good. Let's say that the code quality is now good. There is a policy in place that the reviewer is, let's say, reviewed the code, approved the code, the comments are resolved, the work items are linked, code is all good. But still your build pipeline fails. Can it fail? Yes, no, maybe. Can it still fail
Yes.
because of some reasons? Yes, definitely. It can fail. Your build can fail. Your release can fail. Maybe now I'm telling that the build has failed because of a mistake by a DevOps engineer. Now, DevOps engineers are given the power rather, or are having the power to go ahead, update the pipelines depending upon the requirement. Now, when I say update the pipelines depending upon the requirement, I have to again be a responsible DevOps engineer to do that. So I have a pipeline called SQL build pipeline. Let's say I'm a new DevOps engineer who's joined your organization. I don't know much about DevOps. I'm just trying to, let's say, learn DevOps or something like that. So I just go into a pipeline. And what I do is that by mistake, right, I just go ahead and do something here. So what I did is that I just went ahead, changed the parameter, and it was supposed to be something like this. I completely, let's say, messed it up. Restore is trying to look for something, build is trying to look for something, and all that stuff. And I did a save. And while doing a save, right, I did not even give a comment because I didn't know I had to give a comment. So I did not even give a comment. I saved this out, and let's say I took a holiday. I did not know what I mean. I took, let's say, a holiday out here. And what will now happen is that as and when the developer commits the code, as and when the code is, let's say, committed into the repository, the build pipeline will automatically trigger. I'm just going in and triggering this out manually, and the build pipeline will run as and when you have a code commit out here. And as and when your build pipeline will run, this is going to fail. The build pipeline is going to fail because I did not pass in the right parameter. I did not pass in the right values into my build pipeline. And it's rightly going, I mean, it would go ahead and, let's say, start failing at, let's say, the restore step itself. It would start right away failing at the restore step itself. I mean, my pipeline will get blocked here, which means that though the code quality I'm doing, let's say I'm putting additional measures to take care of the code quality, though this is good, here there is a failure. So there is no artifact, there is no release, there is no update to the code, and the client is not happy with that. The client is telling, where's my code? I do not really care what is happening inside your organization. I'm giving you the money. You have to deliver the code to me. And the code is not there, and simple. The error is coming up telling that there is no file matching and all that stuff. I cannot blame this on a developer. Developer is doing his job. All that is good. This is something as me as a DevOps team, I should have taken care of all these things. And if I look at the history, there's someone who changed, some update happened, but I don't even know what update basically happened out here. There is no comments out here. There is it's very difficult for me to understand now on what change was done because there are multiple moving parts in my pipeline. If you see, right, there are multiple things in my pipeline. Anything would have got changed. This is not in my control at all. Anything would have got changed out here. Now I'll have to be very patient enough to go through each and every step, identify what's the issue. And if I say this is the issue, yes, I'll have to go into each and every step to see whether that particular, let's say, issue is addressed, save it out, and then let my software development lifecycle move forward. Which means, see, with a very small mistake, which could have been avoided, my build is failing, artifacts are not getting produced, release is failing, delivery lifecycle time is getting pushed. Now imagine if you have 100 different pipelines, not just one. I'm talking about just one pipeline. If you have, let's say, 100 different pipelines out here that are delivering code to multiple pieces of, or to multiple, let's say, applications of your client, and imagine that I, as, let's say, a new DevOps engineer, or I, as someone who doesn't have enough DevOps knowledge, goes ahead, changes something on all those 100 different pipelines, imagine how difficult will it, let's say, really make all these things to rectify? How difficult will it make all these things to identify and rectify out here, right? It's going to be very, very, very tough for me as a DevOps engineer to go ahead and address this particular issue out here as such. Now, the question here that I'm asking to everyone is this. As a developer, if you want to update the code into your repository, you will need an approval by one of your technical leads. You will need a work item. You will need comments to be resolved on that particular, let's say, pull request out here. So you need to come up with a pull request. You need to go ahead and do a pull request out here as such. Now, the same question for a DevOps engineer is that, let's address this out. Do I need an approval to update a pipeline or modify a pipeline? Do you think I need an approval here? Yes, no, maybe. What do you all
No.
think?
No.
No, you don't need an approval. All you need is you have the permission, you have the privilege. You can simply go ahead and you can simply go ahead and without even someone asking you to do it, you can just go ahead and update your pipeline. Do you need a work item? Do you need a work
Yes.
item to yes, but where exactly am I linking my work item while updating the pipeline? So
It's
I'm
really
coming
easy.
here, right? I'm coming here. I'll change something. I'm saving this out. Is this asking me for a work item?
No.
No. So even a work item is not required. Even comment resolution was not required. Even PR is not required. Which means, see, I'm opening up my pipelines to, or I'm opening up all my pipelines so that someone can come again and let's say do some errors out here. This is not how it should be. As a developer, if I'm following all these things, even as a DevOps engineer, even that is my duty to go ahead and follow all these things to make sure that my life cycle is going smooth. Meaning, imagine if this particular developer to make this particular change that we did needs an approval, needs a work item, needs a comment, needs a pull request. Now, this error could have been avoided very easily. My software development lifecycle would have been smooth the way it was, right? But that's not the case. Why is it not the case? It's because you cannot just take the branching policies and apply directly to your pipelines. Because all these things like approvers, comment resolution, pull requests, work item linking, and all these things, right? All these things are coming up from a service called Azure repository, branches inside the repository. And I cannot take this particular concept and apply it to a pipeline directly. I cannot do that. I cannot, let's say, directly apply this out. That's where, or that is the biggest disadvantage that you get with something called as a classic pipeline. Classic pipelines are very simple. They are very simple to work with. You can simply go ahead start working with a classic pipeline. They give you a good GUI approach. You can simply go ahead understand how to, let's say, arrange the steps and all that stuff, but they are not efficient. They are not really efficient when it comes to something called as a quality control, QC. They're not really, let's say, efficient out here as such. That's the reason why Azure DevOps is moving towards a concept called pipeline as a code. Pipeline as a code out here as such. Until now, we were talking about infrastructure as a code, where we are writing our infrastructure in the form of a template called ARM or Terraform or PowerShell, whatever it is. Now I'm telling, instead of designing my pipeline, can I write my pipeline as a file and store it in the Azure repository? If I am able to do this, very simple, I'll be able to apply my policies, my locks, my software development life cycles, And also I'll be able to track all the history, because whenever you do something, you will definitely need to give a commit. And whenever you do a commit, you will definitely need to go ahead and, let's say, give a comment out here. Without that, you cannot save it. And also, you cannot directly commit onto the develop branch. You will have to need an approval. You will need, let's say, all those approvals. You need, let's say, all those commit resolutions and all that stuff. This is the idea. What Microsoft is now suggesting is that it's a better way to go ahead and, let's say, write your pipeline rather than designing your pipeline. Of course, I agree, designing the pipeline is much more simpler, much more easier, but it doesn't resolve, or it, let's say, causes a lot of business problems wherein I cannot really have a control on who's editing what. I can still go ahead, control it in the form of, let's say, the permissions that I'm assigning and all that stuff. But again, it is not a very good control or over my pipelines. And that's where pipeline as a code, or the concept called pipeline as a code, comes into picture. And how do you write pipeline as a code is by using a language called YAML. YAML. YAML is the language in which I go ahead and, let's say, start writing my pipeline as a code out here as such. That's what I am, let's say, beginning. Again, I do understand that a lot of people might not understand what YAML really is. So the very first approach, or the very first class right now, is to help you all understand how do you write YAML, what exactly are the basics of YAML, what are the basic components that form YAML, and then we will go into understanding how do we write our pipelines using YAML, what are the advantages, how do you run your pipelines, and all these things out here. Those are the concepts that will flow on. But yes, anyone, any questions still here?
Current, instead of using these built-in features of these pipelines, releases and all this, we are writing with our custom code by using YAML.
Correct, correct. But you'll still use the pipeline feature, but there will be one file which will give you end-to-end procedure like a build and release. And we are going ahead doing it with a YAML code out here. And then we are using that particular YAML file with Azure repositories, and then we are triggering our pipelines from that particular file out here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, okay, correct.
So
Hello,
let's
sir.
see how good, please start.
Sir, previous classes you are downloading SQL zip files, sir.
Hmm.
SQL file, sir. This file is artifact score lab. This is raw code, sir.
That's a raw code. It's not the artifacts. The one that I'm downloading wasn't the artifact. It's a raw code, and we are converting that particular raw code into the SQL.zip.
Okay, okay.
These are my questions, guys. All right, so let's look at the language called YAML, and let's understand how will YAML help me in order to write a pipeline and all these things out. But let's understand the basics of YAML. And in order to understand the basics of YAML, I'll start with something that we know, which is a JSON. I'll start with something that we know, that's a JSON file, and I'll just start writing let's say a storage configuration. Let's say I have a storage account or multiple storage accounts in my organization. I want to store all these things like we did earlier. We had a PowerShell script reading those things out here, right? So I will start writing a JSON file firstly in order to give an example, and then we'll understand how do you use that particular JSON file in order to write a YAML. Again, YAML is a very, very, very simple language when compared to something called as JSON out here as such. So let's get started again. In order to start writing YAML, I'll again use my VS Code editor, one-stop solution. I'm going with the VS Code. I'll open a new folder again, and in here I'll just go ahead, say new folder. I'll say YAML basics, something like that. And I will firstly go into my marketplace extensions and look for something called YAML YAML. As in when I look for this one, there are two extensions that I would install. One is YAML by someone called Red Hat. Just click on the install button here. I have uninstalled here because it's already installed on my machine. Second is called learn-YAML by Microsoft. It's telling you can go ahead and let's say do a YAML schema out here. Please go ahead and also install this out. So two different things that you need. And now I'll start writing something called a JSON file firstly. We'll start with JSON and then we'll go into, let's say, YAML. I'll say storage dot JSON. So I want to write a simple storage account configuration wherein I want to, let's say, store things like the name, the SKU, the containers inside the storage account, the location of the storage account, the replication of the storage account, multiple properties of the storage account out here as such. So now to write a JSON, I'll always start with brackets. So I'd say it is open and close brackets out here. And I'll start with something called name. I'll say some storage one, something like that. And I'll say the resource group name, RG name. And I'll put something called RG1, comma. So please observe this. So I'm doing a key value pair here. So name, RG name, I'll say something like location, ECS2. Let's put one more property called replication. Say this is LRS. So what I'm doing is that I'm just going ahead writing this out. And again, if I just go ahead and say format the selection, I'll be able to, let's say, properly align this out, no problem. So I went ahead, I did something called as, let's say, the key value pair format out here, wherein I'm telling it as name, RG name, location, replication, and all these things out. And I'm going ahead giving something called storage one, RG1, ECS2, LRS, and all that stuff out here as such. Now, if I were to write the same thing in YAML, I'll just go ahead and say add a file. I'll say storage dot, the extension is YAML YAML or YML YAML. Anything is okay. YML is a short form. YAML is also something that is acceptable, not a problem at all. And now if I want to start writing the same properties, I don't have to start with, let's say, the brackets. I don't have to start with all these things. All I will do is just put name, key value pairs. So YAML also supports commenting. So hash, it's a key colon space value. This is important, guys. Between a key and a value, you always need to start with a space out here. So a key space the value. So key value pairs is what YAML really works with, and it also supports commenting. So I put a comment here, and in my case, I'll start with name. I'll say something like storage one. Enter. I don't have to do a comma. I don't have to do, let's say, a quotation. Nothing. I'll say location. I'll say ECS2. Again, if you look at this, I'm not declaring anything in, let's say, quotes and all that stuff. I can just go ahead, let's say, give the way the values are. Then I'll say something like replication, something like LRS, RG name, something like demo RG or RG name or RG1 or something like that. This is as simple as it can get. So if you look at this, same thing, I put in a JSON. I took a JSON out here and I just took this JSON, I converted this, or rather, let's say, represented the same JSON in YAML. This is much more cleaner. All you need to take care of is the spaces. If you don't give a space, I'll start throwing errors, telling that implicit key needs to be, let's say, in a single line and so on and so forth. So you will need a space that is separating your key and the value. Very importantly, a space is something you need to have out here. And also there are a lot of online converters that can just help you, let's say, convert a simple JSON file into a YAML. You can directly take this entire body, go into something like an internet, just go here and search for JSON to YAML converters. JSON to YAML converter, you have JSON to YAML.com. You can just go here, put your JSON, have the YAML. It'll take a second to produce the YAML out of it. So it's pretty easier to just go ahead, take a simple JSON file, throw it inside it, and get a YAML file out of it out here as such. Pretty simple, very effective though. So this is how you start writing the YAML file. Again, it's a simple key value pair definition wherein I'm giving a key separated by a value or separated by a space and then give a value out here as such. I guess any questions here? Anyone, any questions here?
Kiran, like
Go please.
so if like suppose if we take a book as a store,
Mm-hmm,
and in that store if you want like child level books
mm-hmm,
records, in the
mm-hmm.
JSON normally we will declare the parent and then the child will declare all the rows, right?
Right.
Here also same process in ML also. This is one
So you'll also
record.
see that, yes, this is one record. So if I have multiple records, all I would do in JSON is I would start with something called storage props or storage property, something like that. This is the parent key. And in order to declare an array, so you're talking about an array, in order to declare an array, I'll just put a open in a square, close square bracket. This is my first property. You can have one more property out here, wherein I can tell that this is storage 2, RG2, ECS to LRS, and so on and so forth. I can have a third property out here, so on and so forth. All I'm doing is that just separating my child items or my child objects using a comma, and I'm just replicating this object. So the parent now is a storage property, which is now being represented by something like a square bracket out here, inside which I have all these child properties out here, like telling that this is, let's say, the name and the value, name and value, and so on and so forth out here, separated by a comma. This is how I am representing the parent and a child relationship in JSON. But if I come down to YAML, all I do is that just declare my parent out here, telling storage properties. So this is my parent, telling this is storage properties. And if I want to declare a child under this one, so let me do that. The parent and a child relationship, very simple. I'll just copy everything out here, do a tab. As in when I do a tab, even a single tab is okay. But for sanity, I'll just go ahead and say put multiple tabs out here. As in when I do a tab, this is now the parent, and all these now are the child properties of the parent. And if I want to now go ahead and declare something else, let's copy this. And very importantly, indentations are very, very, very important in YAML. In my case, I started the name here. I start one more name out here. But again, since it's an array, I just have to give something called as a hyphen separated by, let's say, a space out here. Then the same thing out here as such. Everything must fall under the same line. That's the, let's say, that's how YAML identifies its own children out here. So this is my first
Shift and tab, right?
child. Sorry,
Shift and tab to move the block, right?
I just
For
did a tab.
indentation.
So for
Just
indentation,
a
yes,
tab.
you can do it. Shift. Yeah, just a tab. So what I did is that I just copied all these things out and did a tab.
No, no, to move
If
the
I do a
block. Yeah,
to move the block the
just a
other
tab.
way,
Okay.
to move the block, it's a tab. To move the block backward, it's a shift and tab.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
Okay, so it's forward and
Yeah.
backward. So if you hit a tab, it'll move forward. So if I go ahead and let's say copy all, just select all these things and just say tab, it'll move forward. If I want to get it back into the same position, shift and tab, getting it back out here as such. So all I'm doing is just separating all these things with a hyphen. And if you observe, guys, I'm starting everything in the same line. So if I want to do a shift tab, I can do it. Make sure that the entire block is moving the, let's say, moving along with each other. If there is even a slight misalignment, YAML will start throwing errors telling that, okay, fine, you know what, this is not how it is. There is an indentation missing and so on and so forth. So I can do a child2, RG2. And if you want, let's say a new one, just copy this entire block. Paste it here again. If you see there is a misalignment out here, say storage 3, RG3, and so on and so forth out here. And everything now is a child and a parent relationship. So each and everything is now a property under a parent object called storage properties, and you can collapse this entire thing, same like you do with the JSON. So 1, 2, and 3 can collapse this out entirely. Same thing happens with a YAML out here. Again, just want to see the YAML body out here. Just go ahead, paste this in. The same thing out here as such. Much more neater way. They just put a tab out here as such. So much more in a neater way out here as such, as compared to what I have done out here as such. Again, how many tabs or how many indentations, that doesn't matter. Even if you have one tab out here, one indentation, good enough. You can just go ahead and let's say start writing your YAML body out here as such. Yes, does it answer your question? And any more questions out here?
Yeah,
Any
correct.
more questions? Good question.
So I think it's similar to the Python code, something with indentation and all.
Well, I'm not too familiar with the Python code. I'm sorry about that. I'm not too familiar with that, but maybe I'm not too sure about that.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, any more questions here, guys? All right, so how do I use this to write a pipeline? This is the main point that I want to really go into. Yes, these are the basics. It's a key value where it looks simple. It's a simple indentation that we really need to look at. But how do I really write a pipeline? What exactly, or how exactly can I start my journey towards writing a pipeline? Is that, let's start by going to the documentation itself. I'll say Azure Pipeline Documentations. Go into the pipeline documentation. Here we'll go into something called key concepts for a new user. Let's go here. And this is what I would like to read about on how do I represent the entire Azure DevOps or the entire Azure DevOps CI/CD in the form of a file, in the form of a YAML file, and this forms the skeleton of your pipeline. This forms the entire skeleton of a YAML pipeline out here. So let's look at it. Let's compare it with something that we know, which is a classic editor, and let's understand how do I really write this out. What do I really do in order to write this out here as such? So let's look at this. Let's take a look at this and let's understand how do you do that. So let's go to a classic release. Let me correct this out because this will cause issues at later point in time. Let's go into code, SQL app, SQL this one, and then SQL CS Proj. Let's copy this out. Let's come back. Good enough. Let's see. So the documentation is now starting to tell that, you know what, if you want to start writing a pipeline, it should start with something called as a trigger. It's telling what is the trigger that you want to really set up. And it's simply asking, do you want to trigger the pipeline when you have something called as a feature branch, or it's a develop branch, or multiple triggers? You can do multiple triggers out here, like main branch, like release branch. As of now, I do not have a release, so it doesn't really show me out here as such. So you can talk about multiple triggers, and this is where a pipeline really starts, and this is what the file is telling you. So I'll say it is a pipeline.yml, and I'm giving the skeleton of this particular file, and I'll start with something called as a trigger. So it is a trigger inside which it is now telling you can give multiple triggers. You can say develop. So if I want to say it's a develop, I'll just come under the trigger, and I'm now mentioning the child properties of the trigger. So this is something that I'm telling, okay, fine, trigger, and under triggers, what are all the triggers that is available, or what are the triggers that is acceptable. So this is now the child properties of the trigger. So what I'll do is that I'll come under the trigger, put a tab, and whatever I write here will become the child properties of that particular trigger. Trigger is the parent, same like I have storage properties as the parent under which I have all these things. I'll say hyphen, I want a trigger for develop branch. I want a trigger for main branch. So I'm telling hyphen main hyphen develop. I want a trigger for release branch. And if you want to, let's say, trigger this pipeline off whenever someone is even raising a feature branch out here, I'll tell feature, whatever feature it is. It can be Kiran, Suresh, Mahesh, whatever it is. I'll say forward slash star. You can also give this. So I can say feature forward slash star, meaning a wildcard here. A wildcard pattern is also supported. So I can also give something called as a wildcard pattern out here. If you don't want a trigger, meaning if you want this to be a manual integration, then let's forget about all these things. Say edit. So what I did is that I can just let's say call all these things and select all these things. I can toggle the line comments, so I can comment everything out. I'll say none. Key value pair in the form of a trigger. This is a manual integration or a manual run out here. If you enable this one, this will be a continuous integration from the developer branch, from the main branch, from the release branch. So whenever your developer is updated, main is updated, release is updated, features updated, you'll have the pipeline continuously triggering out here as such. So this is what trigger really starts with, and this is how you declare something called as a trigger. So after that, it's now telling pipeline always contains something called as a stage. So it's telling a pipeline contains something called as a stage. So this is one stage out here. What you see out here is one entire
When
stage.
do we need trigger? Sorry to interrupt you.
I'm sorry, can you go
When
ahead,
do
please?
we need trigger?
When do we need
No, when
triggers? Hmm? Good. Sorry, complete your question, please.
no no that is that was the question. I mean,
Hmm. When do we
in
need a
which
trigger?
scenarios we
Again,
need trigger?
if you want your pipeline to have a continuous integration, then you mention a trigger out here as such. Meaning you're telling that okay, fine. Whenever a branch called develop is updated, please go ahead and let's say kick off my pipeline automatically. You want a continuous integration strategy. That's when those are the scenarios when you will need a trigger out here as such. So anything that requires a CI.
Kiran, in your
Mhm. Good.
scenario, you are giving at particular time, right? Actually, whenever the developer,
Hmm.
I mean, edit the code,
Okay.
it's happened. It's triggers where at the particular time, whatever you have given, right? Until that, it should be wait, right?
No, it is.
Immediately, whenever
Yeah, no, I did not give a
whenever
particular
I make
time.
the changes, it should be immediately trigger that one. At that time, what we have to do?
It will immediately trigger that one. It will definitely immediately trigger that one because you have given a continuous integration trigger, right? And that's how it is supposed to work.
Okay.
I did not give a time. There is no schedule that I have given.
Okay.
So the schedule is
Okay.
something that I have not mentioned. I'm just telling, yes, this is a continuous integration. I want my pipeline to be immediately triggering out whenever developer goes ahead and let's say updates something onto this particular branch or these branches out here as such.
So in
When we
yesterday's
prefer
class,
the
we have not
schedule
used
thing,
Sorry, I'll just complete Lokesh question and come down to you. Good, please,
yeah, yeah.
Lokesh.
when we prefer the schedule one, at what time we
When we
need that
prefer
one.
a schedule one, again, it depends. Let's say that you are a set of development teams who are working on Azure hosted agents. You have a Azure hosted agent out here. You don't want that pipeline to continuously run whenever a developer is, let's say, committing the code. Probably you want it to run after 5 p.m. You want to, let's say, just trigger one pipeline after 5 p.m., schedule it, run it out. You can simply go ahead and, let's say, mention that particular schedule out here. Disable the continuous integration. When I say disable the continuous integration, all I do is uncheck this out, add a schedule, and in that way I can save the agent time that is running because again when you're going for a free agent, right, you're getting 108 1800 minutes out here. Or probably you have configured a PowerShell script out here. Let's say the other scenarios, you have a PowerShell script out here which goes into your Azure portal, continuously identifies all the stale resources and wants to delete them out. You want this, let's say, pipeline to trigger once in a day. You can do a 24-hour trigger out here. Or you have, let's say, virtual machines that are there in your Azure portal. You want to stop them after, or you want to stop them during the weekends. So you can write a PowerShell script, place it inside your pipelines, and in the trigger, you can add a schedule telling that only on Saturdays and Sundays. You can remove all these things and say only on Saturdays and Sundays. Please run this out, and that pipeline will run only on Saturdays and Sundays out here as such. That's the scenario where you would need a schedule. Whereas in scenarios like the development activity is really agile, my developers want to see the build immediately as and when they are, let's say, merging the code. That's where continuous integration as a process comes into picture, and that's where CI triggers come into picture out here as such. Does it answer your question, Lokesh?
Hello, sir.
Just a second, Renat. Just give me a second. Yes, Lokesh, does it
Yeah,
answer your
that's
question
fine.
first?
That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just give me a second. I'll come back to you. Nirmal, you had a question. Let me take yours and then go back
Uh,
to Richard, Renat.
no, I was just thinking. I mean, yesterday we didn't have triggers, right, in the release pipeline. But
In the
when
release,
the
good.
no, which is based on the build, right? Build pipeline that we have built.
Correct. But even my release had a
When
trigger.
we approve,
Even my release
sorry,
had this trigger.
right.
Even
This
there
is also
was,
continuous
this is a
deployment
continuous
CD.
deployment trigger. It's a CD trigger, exactly. So
Okay,
it's
we
telling
didn't do
creates a
continuous
release.
integration.
No, we did continuous integration as well. Yesterday we had a continuous integration. That's the reason if you see this, it's telling yesterday when you trigger this out, it's an individual CI. It
Right,
triggered because I did a commit and I did a
right.
commit
When
telling
that,
that okay, fine.
right, right. So in that case, when we had that built in, we are
Okay.
again configuring the triggers to trigger the pipeline, right? The CI. Uh,
When I'm saying again, when you say
the
CI,
difference, am I trying to understand the difference from
the
yesterday's
difference
task to
between, I'm
get
sorry. Mhm.
configuring today?
Again, yesterday I configured triggers in a classic pipeline. This is a classic pipeline, right?
Right, right.
Today I'm writing my pipeline in a YAML file. So I don't have the GUI option, and that's the reason I am defining the trigger instead of declaring the trigger.
Okay,
That's the
got it.
difference.
Got it. Got it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yes, Renat, you can go ahead, please.
Hello, sir. We put it trigger configurations Sunday, Saturday only.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, before days or change the program, change the
Hmm.
programming. Sunday, Saturday will be triggered.
Correct. Even if you change it on, I mean, if you have only a schedule to run on Saturdays and Sundays, and if you do not have a trigger out here telling enable continuous integration, and you only have a schedule, it will only run on Saturdays and Sundays, irrespective of whenever you change it. Irrespective of whenever you change the code, it will only run on Saturdays and Sundays. That's the idea of having a schedule out here as such. Yes.
Okay, sir.
Does that answer your
Okay.
question? Okay. Yes, any more questions, guys, before I move forward? So this is a classic, and I'm comparing the classic with how am I writing a YAML using the documentation. So in a classic, I'm coming into the triggers, I'm just saying enable continuous integration. But in a YAML, I am declaring the trigger. So if I'm telling it is none, then it's simply disable this particular continuous integration out here. And if I want a continuous integration, let me comment this out. Let me uncomment all these things. Say edit, toggle line comments. And this is how I'm declaring them, telling that I want a trigger from develop branch. I want a trigger from main branch. I want a trigger from release branch out here as such.
Right.
That's the
We also
primary.
need to enable the continuous integration, this option, right? That checkbox.
Don't have to, because I'm not even touching the classic right now. I'm just comparing how a classic is with the YAML. So when I'm doing a YAML, right, what I'll do is that I'll come here into the pipeline, say new pipeline. I'll start with YAML. I don't even touch my classic here. So this is one of the ways in which you can create a pipeline. This is the second way in which you create a pipeline, which is one of the most, let's say, popular ways out here as such right now. So if I put this into a file, I will not even have this option to go ahead and, let's say, toggle my triggers here. So this is only available for a classic versus this is something that I'm doing for a YAML right now. Does that clear your confusion?
Yes, Karan. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So I'm starting with triggers, and the next thing that the documentation is now telling me is that the pipeline consists of stages, multiple stages out here in a classic pipeline that we have created already. So I'm using the classic as my reference so that I can explain how YAML really works out here. All this is a stage. So I can call it as a build stage or something like that. And this is what is telling that the pipeline contains of stages, and each and every stage should have something called as an agent declared. Here I have declared an agent which is inheriting from the pipeline, of course. So it's telling, yes, this particular agent or this particular stage has something called as an agent, and the agent should have something called as a job to run. These are all my jobs, or rather all these together are now called as my jobs. And each and every job, or job is nothing but a combination of, let's say a job is nothing but a combination of steps. So you have the stage. So the workflow has, or the workflow is something like this. You have a stage under which you can have jobs. You can have something like job 1, job 2, job 3, so on and so forth. And each and every job needs to contain something called as steps. Step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on. And these can be called as steps or tasks out here as such. So this is the alignment of a YAML pipeline, and this is what it's telling you. So stage needs to contain something called agent, and here inside each and every agent there is something called as job. Each and every job there's something called as steps. So if I want to declare that out, I would say something called stages. This is now another let's say a parent item, inside which I can have something called stage. Again, I'm just giving the skeleton, I'm not going into the details of it. Inside under a stage, I can now start going ahead and telling that, okay, fine, this stage needs to have something called as jobs. Under a job, I can say this is job 1. And under this, I can start telling there's something called steps. Under the steps, I can start giving all my tasks. Task 1, I can say this is restore. Like task 2, I can say this is build. Task 3, publish. Again, this is not the actual YAML pipeline. I'm just giving you how the step really flows out here.
We are not
So stages,
writing agent, agent on top of the stages.
that's what I was telling. I'm giving the skeleton. I'm not, let's say, going inside the pipeline. I'm declaring all those things out here. Yes, I would need to, let's say, define the agent and all these things out here. Yes, I need to do that, but I'm not doing that right now. I'll show you how to do that while we actually create a pipeline out here as such. So it starts with trigger, stages, inside which you can have stage 1. If you want to declare another stage, let's say you can call the stage as a build, something like the display name and all that stuff. You can call the stage as a build. You can go ahead do another stage out here as such. The stage, you can have all that particular, let's say, hierarchy under this particular stage out here as such. So this is how it flows out. So you need tasks. You can have multiple tasks out here, 1, 2, 3, and all these tasks needs to come under something called steps. Step is coming under the jobs. Job is coming under the stage. Stage is coming under the bigger property called stages out here as such. This is how the pipeline structure really follows. So in the interview, normally what they ask is that, can you define how a pipeline really starts out? So you can say trigger, stages, inside which you can have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Inside that you can have something called jobs. Inside that you can have steps. Inside that you can have something called task 1, task 2, task 3, and so on. So I'm just giving you the overview of the skeleton as a documentation is telling you right now. So if you look at the documentation, this is what they tell you. stage agent job, and inside that you have steps, tasks, and each and every task can go ahead and let's say do something called build artifact, invoke a REST API call, and so on and so forth. They're just giving you the example out here, and I'm comparing the same thing with a classic build pipeline, wherein it starts with a trigger, you have the pipeline, you have the job out here, inside that you have all these things out here as such. Now, the easiest way in which you can go ahead and let's say try to look at a YAML definition for a pipeline is this. So you have a classic, you know how to write a classic. Once you have written a classic, right? You can just click on these three dots, more actions. You can just say export to YAML. This will give you a YAML file for this particular pipeline. So if I look at this particular YAML file out here, just open this out in the folder. Let's say open in VS Code. This is now my entire YAML definition file for that particular pipeline. So it's starting with trigger, and on top of that, you have something called variables and all that stuff. So you have triggers, you have jobs, and here they did not really mention a stage because it's okay to go ahead and let's say do a job out here, but you'll have a stage on top of it and so on and so forth out here as such. And then you have the name of that particular pipeline, all that stuff out here as such. So this is how you can simply go ahead and export your pipeline, one of the options. But we will try to write a pipeline from the scratch, make this definition much more simpler. This definition is a little complicated, to be honest. We'll make this definition much more simpler. You also have the option to export the entire pipeline in the form of JSON. I wouldn't recommend doing that because it's very, very confusing. But you can really look at the JSON definition also. So if you look at this one, this is the entire JSON body. If I just format this selection, there's about 420 lines of JSON. All these things is your pipeline code versus one simple YAML definition out here as such. So you can export your pipelines. I mean, if you know how to, let's say, go ahead and simply do a classic pipeline, you can simply export the YAML definition to get an idea. But I would say always to go ahead and start writing the pipeline from a scratch. That's always, let's say, beneficial. And I'll also look at the tools that you can use in order to start writing the pipeline. Today, I just wanted to introduce what is YAML and what is the overall skeleton of a pipeline. I did not really write a pipeline today. We'll talk about how do you write a pipeline, what do you do to write a pipeline, and so on and so forth out here as such. Yes, any questions? Any questions still here?
So Kiran, here for triggers, we won't give values.
For triggers, you mean here? Here, you mean?
Yeah, here we
You
won't
can
give
give
values.
values. You can give values if it's a continuous integration. You can say it's a develop, or if you don't want the continuous integration to come into place, you can simply say none, and you can remove this out. So this is a manual trigger, and this is a continuous integration trigger out here. If you disable this and put this one here, this is now a continuous integration trigger out here as such. Was that your question, and does it answer it?
The key na value. Sorry, is
Mhm.
that key or value the develop one for the trigger? How we
Develop
can call?
is it's the value. You can call it as a list because you are giving it as a child value out here, right? So this is a direct value. The none is a direct value. But right now when you do a develop out here, I'm giving it in the form of, let's say, a list out here. I'm telling the triggers can be multiple. So that's the reason I started with something called develop. And if you look at this, right, and this is got, let's say, a trigger branches, and it's telling include and all that stuff. So it's giving you, let's say, multiple additional properties out here. You can call it as a value. You can certainly call it as a value. It's a child property rather. You can call it as a value out here as such. Shouldn't be a problem.
Kiran, can we treat as a that mean calling function? Is that child properties is there, right?
Hmm.
Can we treat as a calling function? I mean, does it take that value from anything, from anywhere?
No, it's just a property of, let's say, the key that you're declaring. So I'm selling trigger. If I say develop, if I say release, and so on and so forth, it's just like giving these values here, telling that okay, fine, you know what, into the trigger. I'm adding multiple triggers out here, say main, something like that, right? So it's just like treating this as a child property out here. That's it. It's just like a child property. That's it. So whenever this branch gets updated, your pipeline needs to trigger out is the idea. Yes, any more questions, guys? Anyone, any more questions here?
No.
All right, so with that, I'll close the session today. I do not want to really stretch this out because I wanted you all to just go through the basics of YAML today so that we can go ahead meet tomorrow and discuss more on what exactly or how exactly can I use this particular YAML in order to write a full-fledged pipeline, and we'll see how to really do that out here as such. Thanks, guys, and have a good day. Thank you.